So we've been looking at several aspects of forests and food security, and I would like to add, I'd like to focus very much on the management issue. Normally certainly the research and much of the thinking about forests and food security have focused on two issues. One was on the direct sort of supply of food from forests, which includes both animals, bushmeat, as Robert talked about, and a whole series of plants and fungi and all that Terry and other people have talked about. And this includes many very important and very interesting issues also of marketing, of processing. There's been a lot of work on gender in the use of forest products and the extraction of forest products. And that's largely been phrased in terms of extraction and how to extract in a way that would allow for continued extraction of these products. The other issues, of course, and these are issues that we feel are not well researched, but the other stream of much research and much thinking has been on the issues of ecosystem services, for example, especially I guess Terry sort of also mentioned a number of these of water flow regulation, of pollination, of climate mitigation, both on a global and local level. So these are the two streams, but there's another one that we're trying to emphasize here a good deal, and that's the issue of managing forests, of really combining the forests and the food security issues and the food production issues both in the same landscape, so how different areas may, for instance, interact, and how one area of the forest may be necessary for continued production in agricultural fields, and then in another way of looking at the management, actually managing forests, maintaining them as forests, but managing both for more food production and more sustained food production. And that's something I'd like to talk about. And since I am an anthropologist and I have been working for many, many decades especially on various types of smallholders and on the smallholder management of these areas, this is what I'd like to talk about. And I'll try to talk about it very quickly because I know that we're all going a little long. So the one thing that seems to still be occurring is that smallholder management of forests tends to be sort of invisible. The truth is that for millennia, forests and non-agricultural ecosystems have been managed to satisfy human needs. Obviously, in the pre-agricultural past, all our food came from some kind of wild systems. And the truth is, we can still talk, and we talk here about wild species and wild systems, but a lot of these are very heavily managed already. There's often been very little recognition that most forests, and some of us, are challenged maybe to give very precise measures of it, but some of us truly believe that, that virtually everything has been managed by people to some extent. People have manipulated species, people have manipulated what's where, and sometimes it's done in very obvious ways, and I've noted that a number of my colleagues here have actually referred to shifting cultivation as a way of managing forests for food. You open up gaps, you plant in some food, you sort of manage the other stuff, and then you let the forest come back, or you manage the forest in various way to come back. That's a pretty obvious kind of human manipulation. But there are many, many other instances of very, very sort of invisible, of very subtle ways the forests are manipulated and have been manipulated for a very long time. Whether it's selective harvesting of certain things and of certain species in particular places, whether it's the transplanting of particular plants from one place to another, and that's done so much more frequently than probably most of us imagine. Whether it's removal of certain kinds of noxious species from certain places, and much of this is done not as an activity that we even have a capacity to talk about. We sort of call it nebulously management because we can't quite call it agriculture, we can't call it extraction. It's somewhere in there, and it tends tends to be invisible, but it tends to be very, very important. Even though there may in the past not have been a whole lot of people hanging around, but they used fire, they used various other tools that were tremendously powerful. So one thing is to just recognize the fact that it already exists, and then secondly, perhaps we can focus on it a bit more to see how we can continue to have forests, how we can continue to have many of the ecosystem services of forests, be it conservation of biodiversity or regulation of water flow, and all those other services that we want, including many cultural services, and yet also actually increase the amount of food. And I think this is a real challenge for us here, and that's one of the things that we hope to come out with when we talk about a roadmap to doing certain kinds of research that would move us in new directions. Okay, and in order to do this, I would actually to sort of just start talking about it, I'd like to give you a very specific example. It's an example that I know a good deal about, although I'm also going to be featuring the research as well as the images and all from other people, most notably from Dr. Eduardo Brundizio, an anthropologist from Brazil, who's at the University at Indiana University in the United States, and had published a wonderful book on acai, and which is a palm that those of you who are from the United States or from Latin America, and I'm not too sure about Europe, but those of you who are from areas that I know better surely know about acai. It's the miracle that's going to make you live forever, be absolutely gorgeous, and very, very slim. And I've eaten an awful lot of acai, and I can tell you it doesn't seem to work quite that magically, but whatever. In any case, it's a very important, it's a very interesting and important example, because it is a species that has been a very, very important food in the estuary of the Amazon for very long, for many, many millennia. It's been considered sort of the food of the rural poor. It's what country bumpkins eat in Amazonia, and then all of a sudden it sort of exploded on the international market as the chic miracle food of the last 2 decades or so. And how that happened is a very interesting issue, and that's actually explored by Eduardo Brundizio in a book that was published by the New York Botanical Garden Press. In any case, it's what I want to give it an example of is how people have always managed and continue to manage acai, this particular palm, in areas where it is native and areas where it's been managed for a long time. And it presents a sort of interesting issue, because as the market has increased tremendously, as it has become an urban food and an export market, there are certain things that have happened. There are certain different kinds of management that have come in, but there's still a sort of locally based, locally knowledge-based management of this kind of forest continues to be extremely important. I'd like to just mention it that this is not from this is from a different part of Amazonia, but the management of many, many different kinds of areas that are dominated by trees and may or may not be called forests or agroforests or even forest fallows or whatever. In Amazonia, there are many, many different kinds of this. This, for instance, is a rather heavily settled area of farther up on the banks of the Amazon, where there are many different kinds of management going on in many different areas. So I'm talking about only one particular kind of management in one particular part of Amazonia, which is only one particular part of the world. And I believe that very similar, it's not similar in species, not similar in specific management practices, but very similar kinds of management are going on, and they tend to be invisible to us. And it's a resource that we really need to know more about, because as we are faced with this need of increasing food production, increasing income, and yet trying to conserve forests and biodiversity, this may be just one part of the puzzle, and it's a puzzle that I think we've been ignoring up to now. It's also a puzzle that gives rights to certain indigenous and local populations that have also been not acknowledged. I just wanted to say there are many different kinds of these systems. Many of them feature other fruits, many of them feature fast-growing timber species, many of them feature other kinds of species. On that graph, which I don't have much time to talk about, it shows sort of an increasing forest cover in certain areas of especially the Brazilian Amazon, of the floodplain. And there are actually in almost all of these municipalities, there is an increase in forest cover, and that's been happening for quite a long time. This is from earlier on, but it's still happening. And a lot of it has to do actually with the increased cultivation of acai, for example, and it's actually replacing cattle pastures in certain areas, especially of the floodplain in the estuary. You can see in 1985, the red stuff sort of shows you areas of acai, of heavy persistence and to some extent management of acai, and you can see that's Brazil, if you could, and that's obviously just the estuary of Brazil, and this marks the municipalities that produced acai in 1985. And if you look at 2004, you can see that acai has actually spread into many parts of the Amazon floodplain where it never existed before. There's actually another species of acai, a euterpe, the euterpe palm that was common there, but they're been replaced by this palm. But again, in many of these municipalities, you'll also see that there's a increase in forest cover, and much of this has to do with acai. And it's Euterpe oleracea is the acai palm. The other one that's sort of more common higher up on the Amazon is Euterpe precatória. And it's by local people, it's been used for a tremendous number of different things. You can see these on the right, we have certain uses. In the middle are the different parts of the palm, and they've been used for many, many different purposes, and it's been a palm that has been managed for a long time. Right now it's being used, only the fruit basically is being harvested in this for this international market, but the quantities, the incomes and all that have been coming out of some of these areas are now much higher than it used to be. So this just extremely briefly, I should be sitting down already, but I won't until I tell you a little bit about how you can actually produce one of these acai-rich forests in many different ways. One is basically to sort of follow a shifting cultivation trajectory, which is sort of selective clearing, often leaving some trees, then usually starting with some annuals and semi-perennials and planting in acai already. And also there's acai all around. It lives in these forests anyway, so also managing a lot of natural regeneration, and then gradually managing it for more and more acai, and you basically come out with an acai agroforest. And I can tell you, if it's managed by smallholders, it tends to have many other species in there because people use many of these things also for their own, for their other uses. But there's another way of doing it. Basically, if you have some unmanaged forest, although it's difficult to even figure out what's unmanaged, then there's a whole trajectory of thinning, transplanting more acai, not getting rid of everything else, but transplanting, thinning some of the stuff that's there, pruning it, and eventually coming up with something that's also very similar, but that again, it's basically started as a forest, it stays as a forest, but you manipulate it. And probably now that the market has increased much more, there's a lot more acai and less of other stuff in there. But in any case, you arrive in this way in various other places. Now there's also you can see some of these other trajectories which are much more on sort of an industrial agricultural level. And if you look at this, it looks very different. There's really nothing between these very much. The diversity is quite low. It still gives you tree cover, but there's much less diversity. But in these, you'll find, and we found that not only do you have rather high plant diversity, because people also tend to be managing for other things, but also quite a lot of animal diversity as well. And I'm going to have to stop talking about this, but there are three different, so there are these sort of acai forests, there are acai fallows that come from agriculture. There's acai planted in house gardens, and these households there tend to rely on all three of them at the same time. They tend to be managing them in many different ways. And these are the acai fruits, but people also sort of plant in, manage in this place for fast growing timber. This is Calicophyllum sprucianum. There are lots of other things that are included there, and there's often a lot of animals as well. You can see here one of our farmers also shows that they have some rice in there, but they plant the rice really not for the rice, but because the rice attracts fish. And this is an area that floods twice a day, and so this is really management for animals rather than for plants. There's not enough rice that you can make much of a meal out of it, but it does bring in fish and all. So there's multi-purpose management and high biodiversity. So again, just to repeat, this is just one instance of a traditional way of managing forests for food, as an apparently sustainable way of doing it, and it's also quite successful in responding to new needs or new markets in this case. And there's much more I could tell you about it, but this is what we really want to focus on now, is whether it's possible to work with smallholder forest management, and not making smallholder forest management just something that follows sort of conventional forestry ideas, but follows these ideas that have been there for a long time, that you can manage both for lots of ecosystem services and manage for food at the same time. And there's and also this may also lead to not only more sustainable diets, more sustainable livelihoods, but also more sustainable landscapes. And with my apologies for going over, if there are any questions, perhaps I can do it very quickly, and then I can move on to the